do acknowledge that Africans enslaved black people before they sold them to white people. You know that, right?
They didn't treat them like white people did.
How do you know?
Because I listen to history.
If she truly listened to history, she'd know that the Africans who enslaved other Africans were just as brutal as the Europeans. Let me explain. So the way the African slave trade worked is that African kingdoms would capture slaves in the interior and then sell them to Europeans on the coast, and they would do this as part of general military campaigns or slave-specific raids. A man named Cudjoe Lewis, one of the last survivors of the Atlantic slave trade, who was captured in his youth, describes the horror of the day his village was raided. He describes a scene of slaughter which included the elderly, with the infamous Dahomey Amazons, an all-female group of warriors who carried out mutilations of the bodies. They would rip off people's jawbones and even walk round carrying severed heads. Raids were only the beginning of the tragedy. Slaves were transported to the coast in long lines known as coffles, where they were bound with ropes and chains. The journey could last weeks or months, and there was a heavy death toll from thirst, disease, and exhaustion. Not to mention the heavy violence their African masters would inflict on them if they slowed down. The slaves who remained in Africa often fared little better. Dahomey, for example, had annual celebrations where they would sacrifice hundreds of slaves and captives at once. This mass sacrifice also occurred after the death of kings, with the successor of King Gezo rounding up hundreds of slaves and sacrificing them in honour of the late king's memory.